The day the HOA stormed onto my property demanding my lake was the day I realized Uncle Silas's warnings weren't superstition. They were prophecy carved in ink and blood. I'd only been in Pine Valley for 72 hours. My cabin still smelled of varnish and old timber. My boxes were half opened, and the sound of the forest still felt unfamiliar, like the mountains themselves were studying me. Then came the parade of black SUVs up my gravel drive, glinting in the sun like a convoy of crows. Out stepped Victoria Ashworth, queen of Pine Valley's Homeowners Association, draped in power and perfume, clipboard in hand like it was a sword. "Mr. Brennan," she called before even reaching my porch, "this lake now falls under HOA jurisdiction." No greeting, no courtesy, just a declaration, like she was reading a royal decree. Behind her, a few suited men fanned out, snapping photos of my dock, my boathouse, my well pump. My fingers tightened around my coffee mug. "Ma'am," I said slowly, "this lake came with my uncle's land deed. You don't get to waltz up here and—" She cut me off with a smile so polished it could have sliced glass. "The association manages community water access, and your property sits within our environmental buffer. You'll need approval for any activity, including private use." That was my introduction to Pine Valley's version of neighborly welcome. I'd expected small talk and maybe a pie. Instead, I got a legal ambush. Victoria's words weren't really about the water. They were about control. Everything about her posture screamed that she was used to people backing down. I didn't. Not when it came to Silas Brennan's land. My uncle spent 40 years building this place. Every log hand-cut, every inch paid in sweat and stubborn pride. Before he passed, he left me two things: the deed and a letter sealed in wax that read, "Never sell. Never surrender. If they come for the water, dig deeper." I hadn't understood what that meant until Victoria's shoes crunched on my gravel drive. When they left that afternoon, I stood on the porch watching the dust settle, my heartbeat sinking with the wind through the pines. I could still hear her warning echoing in the air. "You'll find compliance easier than defiance." I'd met bullies before, corporate ones, political ones, but something about her calm confidence chilled me. It wasn't arrogance born of ignorance. It was the certainty of someone who believed the system itself was her weapon. That night, I sat by the lake with a flashlight and a bottle of bourbon, flipping through the property documents Silas had left. The lake wasn't just within the boundary line, it was the boundary. The deed traced the water line in precise ink, marking every inlet and dock, which meant legally anyone using those docks, HOA members or not, was technically crossing into my property. The irony made me laugh out loud. They thought they owned me because they'd built their fancy subdivision around the lake. But the water they cherished, the docks they charged residents to use, all of it rested on my land. My uncle hadn't left me just a cabin and a view. He'd left me leverage. But leverage doesn't mean much if your opponent plays dirty. Over the next week, the harassment campaign began. HOA letters started arriving in stacks. Warnings for unapproved exterior colors. My cabin was brown pine, for God's sake. Citations for non-compliant shoreline vegetation, and even a notice claiming my dock lights violated community aesthetics. Then came the social pressure. Strangers posted online calling me the recluse up north, claiming I was endangering property values by hoarding community resources. I hadn't even introduced myself, and already I was the villain of Pine Valley. I'd been in the Marines long enough to recognize psychological warfare when I saw it. They weren't trying to find me, they were trying to break me, isolate me, make me sell. That's how they'd taken dozens of small plots around the valley, by exhausting people until they walked away. But Silas's letter whispered louder every night, "Dig deeper." So I did, literally. Under the cabin's crawl space behind a stack of old lumber, I found a rusted lockbox the size of a shoebox, sealed with 2 padlocks and wrapped in plastic. Inside were files, maps, and letters, records that traced back 50 years. My uncle had documented every land exchange, every shady HOA transaction, and, most importantly, the original incorporation papers for the Pine Valley Lake Association. Back then, the HOA didn't even exist. The lake and its docks had been part of a public-private partnership, one my uncle co-founded. He still held a silent controlling share. The discovery hit me like a thunderclap. The lake they claimed as theirs legally fell under a company that was mine. For the first time since Victoria's visit, I slept easy. I didn't tell anyone what I'd found. Instead, I started playing along. When the next citation arrived, I paid it with a smile. When they called for community inspections, I offered coffee. I wanted them to think they'd won. Meanwhile, I quietly filed paperwork at the county courthouse to reactivate the dormant Pine Valley Lake Association charter, under my name. By the end of the month, the HOA's confidence was absolute. They scheduled a public meeting to announce a lake management transition, where they'd unveil new dock regulations and rental fees. I showed up in jeans and boots while everyone else wore suits and pearls. Victoria greeted me with that same razor-sharp smile. "Mr. Brennan, I didn't expect you'd come." I handed her a folder. "You should have." Inside were copies of my filings, notarized, legal, irrefutable. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Watching her expression crack was enough. When she stammered, This must be a mistake," I simply said, "It's not. You've been using my property for profit without consent." Gasps rippled through the hall like wind through dry leaves. A few board members turned pale. Victoria tried to regain control, muttering about pending review and due process, but the crowd wasn't listening anymore. For the first time, Pine Valley's residents saw the Empress without her crown. After that day, silence from the HOA was deafening. No more letters, no more threats, just quiet resentment simmering in manicured lawns. But the fight wasn't over. I'd embarrassed them publicly, and people like Victoria don't forget humiliation. They plot revenge. So I waited. And when they came again, because they always do, I was ready to dig even deeper. The calm after my first confrontation didn't last long. By the next morning, the mountain air that once smelled of pine and wet soil carried the sour bite of gossip. Local news trucks rolled up the gravel road like a convoy of vultures, their antennas glinting in the sunlight. I could hear the buzz of camera drones before I even stepped outside. They weren't here for the beauty of the lake. They were here for blood. Victoria had struck back faster than I expected. Her influence stretched beyond HOA meetings and fines. She had friends in local media, sponsors in city offices, and a reputation she'd cultivated like a garden of thorns. The first headline hit by noon. "Mountain Recluse Threatens Community Safety. HOA President Speaks Out." The photo they used wasn't even recent. It was one from years ago. Me in work boots and a welding mask, sparks flying, shadows harsh. To them, it looked like menace. Within 48 hours, my face was everywhere. My name, once known only to a few contractors and old mountain locals, was suddenly trending online. Victoria fed the narrative masterfully, painting me as a volatile loner with dangerous secrets. Reporters called my phone, my email flooded with questions about militia ties, unpaid taxes, hidden weapons. The absurdity would have been funny if it hadn't cost me peace of mind. Every time I tried to leave my driveway, someone was there with a microphone or a drone hovering above. At night, headlights paused outside my cabin too long to be accidental. Neighbors who used to wave now looked away. Fear was Victoria's favorite tool, and she was an artist with it. Sarah called me one evening after another slanted report aired. "They're trying to isolate you," she said, her voice steady but low. "Classic strategy. Paint you as the monster, then sell themselves as the heroes protecting everyone else." She'd seen this before, in cases involving corrupt developers and fraudulent associations. "Don't respond yet. Let them dig their own hole." I wanted to believe patience was the right weapon, but watching Victoria twist the truth with such precision burned deep. Still, I knew anger was exactly what she wanted. A headline reading, "HOA Critic Loses Temper, Confirms Threats." So I waited. I documented every false statement, every fraudulent claim, every harassment attempt. My Uncle Silas hadn't built his empire by shouting. He built it by outlasting. A week later, Victoria made her boldest move yet. She filed an official complaint with the county, alleging that my lake, my inherited lake, was an unregulated hazard, threatening the safety of nearby properties. It was laughable, but she attached doctored photos of erosion damage and polluted runoff that didn't even exist. The county environmental officer, likely pressured by her board connections, sent me a notice demanding immediate inspection. The trap was clear. If I resisted, I'd look guilty. If I complied, she'd spin it as proof of wrongdoing. So I set a coffee pot for the early morning and waited by the porch, paperwork ready. When the officers arrived, they looked almost embarrassed. Young, polite men with badges that didn't quite match their nervous faces. They found nothing wrong. No pollution, no erosion. The water was clear enough to see trout darting beneath the surface. One of them even apologized. "Honestly, Mr. Brennan, this looks better than half the public reservoirs we test." But that didn't stop Victoria. That night, she went live on local television. Standing in front of the HOA office with her perfect posture and tailored suit, she addressed the community with the confidence of someone who'd rehearsed every syllable. "We will not be intimidated by individuals who disregard community safety," she declared. Behind her, a group of board members nodded solemnly for the cameras. "Our goal is simple, protecting our families and preserving property values." I almost admired her performance. She didn't just lie, she choreographed it. Within hours, social media pages dedicated to protecting Pine Valley popped up, all echoing her words. Fake accounts flooded comment sections with outrage, my inbox filled with anonymous threats. Someone even nailed a sign to my gate that read, "Go back where you came from." I stared at it under the morning fog until Sarah arrived. She didn't say much, just pulled the sign down, broke it in half, and tossed it into the fire pit. "Let her keep shouting," she said. "We'll answer once." And so I built my answer. Day by day, in silence, I gathered every deed, every transfer record, every legal proof that Silas's company still owned the land beneath their homes. Sarah helped me cross-check each document against county archives, building a chain so airtight even Victoria couldn't wriggle through. Meanwhile, federal investigators who'd started looking into her misuse of HOA funds began reaching out quietly, asking for background. The dominoes were trembling even if she didn't see it yet. What she thought was victory, a smear campaign gone viral, was actually the sound of her empire cracking. By the second week, tension in Pine Valley had reached its boiling point. Families whispered in grocery store aisles, board members avoided Victoria's gaze, and even her loyal inner circle started showing cracks. The lake became a symbol of rebellion. Kids still came to fish despite her new restricted access signs. Teenagers graffiti-tagged slogans like "Free the water" on old fence posts. I didn't encourage it, but I couldn't deny it made me smile. The truth was leaking out faster than her lies could contain it. When the news finally broke, an anonymous tip exposing discrepancies in HOA financial records, it was like striking a match in dry grass. Suddenly, the same reporters who'd camped outside my house wanted her comments. But Victoria doubled down. She called an emergency community meeting for Friday night, claiming she had irrefutable evidence of my criminal activities. Sarah looked up from her computer when the email invite hit. "That's it," she said. "She's going to self-destruct. All we have to do is show up." The night before the meeting, I couldn't sleep. The forest outside hummed softly with crickets and wind, but my mind ran like a machine. Every memory of my uncle's lessons, every injustice Victoria had thrown my way, they all pulsed through me like quiet thunder. I wasn't walking into a meeting anymore. I was walking into a reckoning. The morning came cold and gray. I polished my boots, shaved, and packed every document into the old leather folder that had once belonged to Silas himself. It still smelled faintly of tobacco and cedar. Before leaving, I stood by the lake one last time, watching the surface ripple in the breeze. For months, they'd claimed it was a danger. Funny thing about water, it reflects whatever stands above it. Today, it reflected calm strength. When I arrived at the Pine Valley Community Center, cars were parked all the way down the road. News vans again, but this time they weren't here for me. The air inside was electric, filled with whispers and camera lights. Victoria stood at the front, already commanding the stage like a politician on election night. She was smiling too much, her eyes glittering with a mix of fear and pride. On the screen behind her, the title read, "Protecting Our Community, the Marcus Brennan Threat." Sarah leaned toward me and whispered, "You ready?" I nodded once, the weight of the folder heavy in my lap. Victoria began her speech, painting herself as the guardian of Pine Valley, accusing me of everything from tax fraud to terrorism. Her words rolled over the crowd like waves of poison, and for a moment, I almost pitied her. Almost. I waited until she finished her grand finale, until the applause, weak and scattered, faded into uneasy silence. Then, when she asked, "Does anyone else have concerns about this man's threats?" I stood. The entire room turned toward me as I walked down the aisle, the sound of my boots echoing off the old carpet. Victoria's confidence faltered. You're not allowed to speak here," she stammered. But I smiled, calm as the lake she wanted so badly. "Actually, Victoria," I said, "I think you'll find I have more right to speak here than anyone else." The murmurs grew louder. Her face drained of color. I placed my folder on the podium and looked directly into the camera lenses, ready to turn her empire of lies into ashes. When I stood at the podium that night, the air inside the Pine Valley Community Center felt electric, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Victoria's slideshow still glowed on the screen behind her, my face plastered beside the word threat in bold red letters, but every eye had shifted toward me. I could feel the confusion ripple through the crowd like static. These were the same neighbors who had avoided eye contact with me for months, who had whispered behind curtains, who had believed every rumor she'd spread. Now they were waiting to hear if the villain in their story had just turned into something entirely different. "I think," I said calmly, laying the folder on the podium, "you all deserve to know the truth about the land beneath your feet." My voice didn't need to rise. The weight of the words did the work. For 27 years, this community has been paying mortgages on homes built over property owned by Brennan Holdings LLC, my family's company. Every driveway, every garden, every patch of lawn you fought over during HOA meetings, it all sits on land that legally belongs to me. The room erupted. People gasped, shouted, turned to one another demanding explanations. Victoria froze, mouth open, color draining from her face. She tried to speak, but her voice cracked like glass. "That's absurd," she hissed. "This is private property, our property." I unfolded the original deeds, each one notarized, stamped, verified, the paper edges yellowed but undeniable. "Not according to these," I said. When the original developer defaulted, my uncle, Silas Brennan, purchased the entire subdivision's land debt. "You all bought houses, yes, but the land remained under our ownership. The HOA you've been paying into? It's been operating on land you don't own. Which means every dollar Victoria collected, every fine she issued, every so-called maintenance fee was illegal." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the cameras seemed to hold their breath. Then Sheriff Davidson stepped forward from the front row, hat in hand, his voice low and grave. "Mrs. Ashworth, I've got verified documents here that back up what he's saying. You've been collecting association fees for property you didn't control." Victoria's eyes darted around the room like a cornered animal. "You don't understand. I've spent years keeping this neighborhood safe, keeping people like him out." Her hand trembled as she pointed at me. "He's lying to destroy what we built." But her voice no longer carried the same authority. The spell had broken. A woman in the crowd, Beth Morrison, the treasurer who had quietly met me at the diner days earlier, stood up holding a stack of copied invoices. "He's telling the truth," she said, voice steady. "Victoria's been stealing from us. Here are the fake companies she paid with our fees." A murmur of outrage swept through the room. Neighbors began shouting questions. Someone yelled, "Where's our money, Victoria?" Another demanded, "Did you really call the cops on him just to hide this?" Victoria's composure finally snapped. She lunged for the papers on the podium, shrieking, "You can't take this from me! I am this community." But before she could reach me, Sheriff Davidson caught her by the wrist. The microphone toppled, screeching feedback through the speakers as federal agents stepped forward from the back of the hall. Sarah had called them minutes before the meeting. "Victoria Ashworth," one agent announced. "You're under arrest for wire fraud, document forgery, and filing false federal reports." The flash of camera bulbs filled the room like lightning. The mighty queen of Pine Valley was being led away in handcuffs, her perfectly pressed blazer now just armor collapsing under truth. The crowd's fury melted into stunned silence as the doors closed behind her. I turned back to them, taking a breath that felt like exhaling years of weight. "I didn't come here to destroy you," I said. "I came to stop what was destroying us." I laid out the plan Sarah and I had written in the days before, the same plan I'd called Plan D. "Here's what happens next," I continued. "Anyone who participated in harassment or falsified statements, you'll have 30 days to relocate. Everyone else, your rent will be cut in half starting immediately. Brennan Holdings will transition ownership of each lot to the families who've built lives here at cost through zero-interest financing. No more hidden fees. No more fines for mailbox colors or garden lengths. Just neighbors, real ones, building something honest together." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then an elderly man in the back, Mr. Peterson, who had once called me a threat online, stood up and clapped. It was slow, hesitant, but it was a start. Then others joined. Applause spread like wildfire until the entire hall thundered with it. Sarah leaned over and whispered, "You just turned an execution into a resurrection." That night, under the crisp mountain stars, I walked home past houses that no longer looked like fortresses. Porch lights flickered on as people waved awkwardly, tentative smiles replacing the suspicion that had lived in their eyes for months. Change was happening, not through revenge, but through revelation. 3 months later, Pine Valley was unrecognizable. The rigid HOA bylaws had been replaced with a community charter written collectively by the residents. Kids played where no trespassing signs used to hang. The lawns weren't perfect anymore, but they were alive, filled with gardens, laughter, and imperfections that made them human again. Victoria's house stood empty for a while, its windows dark until the sheriff auctioned it to repay stolen funds. Ironically, the new owner used the space to open a free legal aid office, the first branch of what we later called the Silas Brennan Justice Fund. That fund, built from restitution and recovered assets, began helping families across 3 states fight back against corrupt HOAs and fraudulent developers. First call came from Oregon, an elderly couple trying to save their century-old farm from being condemned for a corporate warehouse. I didn't hesitate. Sarah and I packed our files, and Emma, who'd just been accepted to Colorado State on a full scholarship, insisted on helping with the legal research. "Guess the fight runs in the family," Sarah said with a grin as Emma highlighted case precedents, late into the night. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same land that once divided people had now become the foundation for something bigger, something that protected others from the kind of abuse we'd endured. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the Pine Ridge, I sat on my porch with Sarah, listening to the faint hum of a community barbecue down the hill. Smoke drifted up through the trees, carrying the scent of burgers, cedar, and forgiveness. Emma ran past with a handful of kids chasing fireflies, her laughter echoing across the valley. "Hard to believe," Sarah said. "This was a war zone 6 months ago." "Uncle Silas used to say every storm clears the air," I replied. "Guess he was right." She nudged me with her shoulder. "So what now, Mr. Landlord turned reformer?" I smiled, watching the stars bloom in the darkening sky. "Now we make sure no one else gets trapped in a nightmare like this. We use what Silas left behind to build, not to burn." In the distance, the faint glow of porch lights shimmered across the lake. For the first time in years, the reflection was calm, undisturbed by conflict or fear. The story could have ended with destruction, with evictions, lawsuits, revenge. But that wasn't the legacy Silas wanted, and it wasn't the man I wanted to become. The power he left me wasn't meant to crush people. It was meant to show that truth, wielded carefully, can restore what greed destroys. When the next letter arrived, from that Oregon family, Emma handed it to me like a mission brief. "They heard about what you did here," she said. "They want your help." I looked at Sarah, then back at my daughter, whose determination mirrored mine. "Then let's give them what Pine Valley got, a fair fight." As we packed our files for the road ahead, I glanced one last time at the community below. Laughter, music, real connection. Victoria's empire of fear had collapsed, but from its ashes, something stronger had risen. Something rooted not in control, but in trust. "Ready?" Sarah asked, locking the truck. "Always," I said, sliding behind the wheel. The gravel crunched beneath the tires as we started down the mountain road, headlights cutting through the mist. Somewhere out there, another battle waited, but this time we weren't alone. Because when people stand together against corruption, even the biggest HOA bully can't control the land forever.